Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, where we talk about how writers work, how writing works, and why the best writers risk being strange. I'm talking to David Lee, who's the author of a number of books, including Mythical Man, um, Dream of Me as Water, and most recently, Not All Dragons. And David, I just want to say, I love the title Not All Dragons.
Thank
Can you
you.
talk a little bit about that title, sort of where you came up with that and how that sort of represents the book to you?
I was I've been thinking about when this question would come up because it's well, here's the thing. I started writing this book probably 4 or 5 years ago, and I felt like I had like a pretty good grasp of like what was going on, but I didn't have a title for it yet. I was just kind of playing around with the writing. And when I had like a bulk of like the book, what I thought was nearly done, still titleless, I started like sending out queries to literary agents. And I realized that they needed a title for the submission. And I was like, oh crap. And I forget what I was doing exactly, but I needed to be out of the door very quickly and I wanted to get this submission. And so I didn't really think about it. I just kind of came. I just put on Not All Dragons. And I was like, oh, that has a ring to it for some odd reason. And that's just honestly how the title came about. But I think it kind of was stirring for a while, given the things and themes I was talking about in the story that was talked about in the story about kind of fitting in and identity and kind of what the image and idea of a dragon, traditional or non-traditional, is. And I felt like this title, the three kind of really succinct words, really encapsulated this fraught kind of relationship with an idea or an identity that is so mythic and big. Yeah, and I liked how quiet it sounded. I liked how it really just was like kind of a cozy title, I think, for a fantasy book. And yeah, that's where it came from, from a submission form that needed me to put in a title.
It almost feels at a glance to just be almost a little jokey as well, like, well, not all
Mhm.
dragons are like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, totally.
So it feels like it
Exactly.
has like I love the how it sets sort of a fun tone and gives a interesting idea of the sort of a dragon that's a bit off kilter perhaps,
Yeah.
and that a world that's maybe not quite the precise fantasy world you might expect, and so
hmm
on.
hmm
Um,
Yeah, I really wanted to. I liked that atmosphere that was kind of, I felt every time I was drafting the book, this kind of off-kilter world where things weren't completely, black or white. And in every kind of relationship between like the main character Reese and all that he encounters, there's kind of this ambiguity between, what he thinks of witches and mermaids and the fae. Like there's really kind of this unknown component to the creatures, and it kind of adds this kind of like beautiful layer I found while writing it. Yeah.
can you talk a little bit about the sort of origins of that world building project in a sense, or the book in a general sense? Where did the idea to write the book come from, insofar as it connects to a world building uh, background for the book? Because I find a lot of times um, in the fantasy genre, or for lack of a better way to put it, there's an overemphasis on world building,
Yeah.
and yet it's easy to get caught up in it and
Yeah.
never write anything.
Right. Right.
And I wonder if you had that experience where you felt yourself getting caught up in it at all, or just how you managed to sort of,
Right.
balance building a somewhat unique world versus, just grabbing one that exists. Because a lot of fantasy writers will simply kind of grab the kind of generic
Yeah.
fantasy world of
Yeah.
Tolkien-ish
Mhm.
creatures and just grab it, and then they can do their own world building inside of that. But they sort of have a formula and a pre-made, set of like a recipe, uh,
Mhm.
in a sense for that kind of story, which is good and bad. But the one of the good things about it is not having to get so wound up in world building.
Yeah.
Whereas once you sort of started, anytime you're moving off that recipe, just for lack of a better way to put it. You have to kind of get further or deeper into world building, which I think has always the possibility of paralyzing a writer. And I'm
Mhm.
curious to know, like, just sort of what your experience was or what your relationship was to, just sort of fleshing out a world.
Yeah, so the you've touched on kind of the anxieties that I was feeling of the overwhelming kind of prospect of world building. I think so. I'll start by saying you asked kind of where this story came from and the world that it stems from. The story came from a poem in my first book, Mythical Man, called Boy. It's a very short poem, I think 6 lines long. And the image of this boy who was like hiding under a pile of leaves always stuck with me. And it has always, been in the back of my mind. And that's kind of where, I developed Reese from for this story. In terms of placing him in a world, a fantasy world, I was very terrified of creating that. For the longest time, the place that he was in was simply called the country with a capital C, because I didn't want to name the world because I knew that once I named the world, then I feared that it would kind of have this kind of big kind of influence, overwhelming influence over me, and the anxieties you're just talking about, this consuming factor to it. So I did, play around a bit, but and by the time I got around to finishing the draft, the world was loose. It was very not very set in anything, anything concrete. And that was because of my own fear of writing a fantasy world. Because I'd like to read fantasy. I don't like a very consuming world with intricate magic systems and politics. That's really can be overwhelming for me when I'm reading. When I'm watching it, I can do it. When I'm reading, it's a bit harder for me. And that's kind of why I held myself back, excuse me, from diving into the world of Lanelia, which ended up being the world of dragons. And it wasn't until I was working with my editor that they really pushed me to like, you know, dive in with the world building. And I think when I got that permission and I knew that I had someone to kind of be a sounding board for the things that I was adding into this world, it really made me feel a lot better into like, okay, I can jump in a bit and flesh out some of the characters and how they relate to the land and each other. And in doing so, in terms of like keeping myself feel grounded and not being overwhelmed, I was really kind of aware of how much I gave in terms of like the histories of the certain creatures and kind of where they came from. Because I find that in my own taste, I like fantasy that doesn't do a lot of explaining, that doesn't over-explain to like tell the reader this has happened because of X, Y, Z. They are like this because of this event. I like the ambiguity. I like to think about the stories a bit after when the book is done and kind of wonder to myself, oh, wonder what happens between these two groups of people and creatures. And I kind of carry that into the book here by giving little tidbits of, where the certain groups come from. And I think that adds a layer that is a bit more interactive to readers that can really, they can think for themselves kind of what is in the world. And that's the fun of fantasy for me. That's why I like reading fantasy, kind of to come let my own imagination build out the world that's presented in me. So yeah, working with an editor to like give me permission to play a bit more was really helpful in grounding the world. And I think one tool that really helped me was it kind of came about kind of by happenstance was naming the fruit in the book. There's, brine vine, sun pearls, morning berries. I really somehow ended up combining words to make up fruit and other things, and that gave me permission to like, okay, I can do more here, have the characters interact with what they eat of it, and that kind of helped me understand the land that they exist in and the effects or what's happening to the land because of the the antagonists in the book, the unravelers who taint kind of the magic of Lanelia and begin kind of ripping things apart. And yeah, so yeah, it was a very interesting journey to create a world. And um yeah, I'm happy with how it turned out, but of course there are things that I would love to change and build upon. But yeah, it's still a learning process for me building fantasy worlds, I think. Yeah.
So it sounds like you were proceeding initially, at least from more of a character focused or plot
Yeah.
focused sort of,
Yeah, because the first kind of idea and image of the book was the ending scene that came to me, and I understood where Reese was going to end up. And being that kind of the impetus for the story, it was initially, I think, very character focused because I had to unravel where he came from, how he ended up in the situation he will eventually end up in. Yeah, and I think I wrapped myself maybe too much in the character sometimes, and not much about what happens around them. But yeah.
I feel like that's the best approach for fantasy in a broad sense, though, myself. Maybe I'm wrong, but my complaint always is when I read fantasy novels in draft or I was asked to, edit something or whatever. My complaint always is there's a tendency that authors in the genre have to just build all this backstory,
Hmm.
but the backstory isn't the story.
Right.
And so, and they get very married to it
Hmm.
sometimes, and I found myself in discussions where I'm like suggesting they cut 300 pages,
Oh
just cut it.
no.
Start the novel on page, 305.
You're an author's best dream, but
But, I was talking to one person once where they had written a trilogy of books, but the main character in the trilogy didn't appear until the second book. And I was
Mhm.
like, like it's unfortunate they hadn't started with an outline,
Mhm.
and just really pinned down what the story is,
Mhm.
because there's a tendency, and I think I also you can praise and blame Tolkien for it, perhaps. There's that tendency to overload the world with detail that doesn't matter to
Right.
what's going on.
Mhm.
And I prefer this sort of the other approach. I'm involved in a fantasy world, let's call it, called the Shared World. This series of books, and the premise of the Shared World is anyone can write a book set in the shared world. Anyone can write a story set in the shared world. And so, when you're writing a shared world story, you're just simply concerned with what is going on in the world in front of the characters. And all you have to do in terms of world building is deal with that. And you don't contravene what somebody else wrote about the world. But you're just dealing with this immediate thing. And so it just is a world that is a fantasy world that's being built in an accretive style, as opposed to, a top down, this is the Bible of this world, which I
Yeah.
understand that impulse when I was younger. I was, trying to do that kind of thing, but it just always would lead into these dead ends for me where, you'd have all this great stuff about this world, but nothing was going on in the world.
I think because it's definitely worthwhile, what I've learned is to consider world building not as so much an external thing. World building happens, I think, as much inside characters as much outside, because I think what makes a world captivating and intriguing, it's another synonym, is that how we people slash characters perceive the world, right? That builds the world, that builds the relationship. Understanding your relationship to certain systems, groups, that kind of gives texture to the world. And in being so, the world is different for every character. And that's to me what makes, a really intriguing fantasy world, I think. And I think that's where it helped me focus on the character first, and where he relates to everything.
I like that way of thinking of it, of, sort of the world building also kind of happening inside the character in that
Yeah.
way, or in relation to a character. I was talking to a fantasy author once who they were writing about they were writing this fantasy story, and they were explaining to me, like in
Hmm.
person, just all the things about the economy in this world. Like,
Hmm.
how does money work in the world? What are the sort of denominations of money? And I was I'm listening to them. Then I said, "But does this guy have any money?" you know, but that's what matters on a certain level.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, exactly kind of, what we're talking about. It's what are the characters' relationships to these like complicated or non-complicated systems, right? That's what's important. That's what's gonna I feel like will propel the story forward. Because as much as you build out, currency systems and political systems, it doesn't really go anywhere unless the characters are confronted with it or have to find a way around it. Um, that is when the world opens up. I think I think giving very not as much detailed descriptions and narrative around the world, you can make up for it within how the characters react to what little description, what details are given, right? I think that's kind of one of the pillars that I've kind of built to understand how to write a fantasy narrative for me at least. There's tons of ways of doing it. I think for me, I found that I like to focus in what the characters are feeling and how they are yeah, how are they placed in the world? Yeah.
Now, can you talk a bit more broadly about just what the story is on a basic level and sort of
Yeah.
the overall shape of that world?
So yeah, not all dragons. I call it a cozy fantasy set in a world called Lanelia. The name came from just me playing with sounds and how they come out of my mouth. Um, so it's about an amnesiac boy. His name's Reese. He finds and befriends a mermaid named Delia, and basically they go on a journey to uncover his past. He doesn't remember anything about who he is or what he is, but it ends up the journey that they end up taking becomes something much bigger and more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. And I think it's a story about, who you are and who you are scared of becoming, but also who is there for you. And it also explores questions of selfhood and transformation through the lens of, beautiful fantasy. I think it's a soulful kind of memory mystery kind of book. Yeah, that's kind of, I think, encapsulates what it is.
Now, when you're working with a fantasy creature like a dragon, how do you find a way to make it's a weird question, but how do you find a way to make dragons interesting? Because of course there's a level where they're immediately interesting because they're dragons, but there's also a level where they're everywhere. And it's even been said that fantasy can fall into the camps of like there's dragons everywhere, or the dragons are gone, but one day they'll return. Dragons are so definitive in the genre, and the whether they're existing in the world or how the relationship to the world is so fundamental in many areas. How do you find your own approach to things like something as you know let's say world defining as a dragon in fantasy?
hmm I really have always been obsessed with dragons. I think about seven of them tattooed on me. Um, it's because of that, I wanted to write a story that kind of flips the idea of what a dragon is, not as a visual kind of um a device, but the idea, the things that they encompass, and how I wanted to also keep the mythic feeling of a dragon because they are so impressive and captivating to people, and I think that's because of their their unrealness, right? There's this unattainable grasp of what a dragon is, but yet it's everywhere. So in the world of Lanelia, they are kind of mythologized in their own way, and they kind of influence the creatures in separate ways. I can't really go into so much about what a dragon is in the book, just because it's kind of key to how it propels the narrative. I would say that the idea of a dragon in my book is something that is will always be unattainable, and you kind of have to make kind of peace with that and kind of always have this reverence for them, I think. And having that understanding kind of like frees the characters up to kind of explore who they are in terms of, in terms of like not related to a dragon, if that makes sense.
No, I think so. And when you're working in a in like, am I mistaken in thinking this is your first novel, or is this your second novel? I believe it's
This
your
is
first, is it not?
this is my first novel,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah.
So what was the jump like to the novel for you?
So I come from a background of poetry. Um, having always wanted to be kind of a novelist, but I fell into poetry and found that it's really exciting. And the jump happens, like I said earlier, the story kind of stemmed from a poem in my first book. And I think my background as a poet in 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 loving to play in singular moments and giving them texture through images and other kind of devices. I carry that over into the story in just kind of expanding kind of what I was playing with in my poetry, in that a poem doesn't really give me the space to really dive into a world, not so much as fiction does. So I think the jump was difficult at first because I had to struggle. I was struggling with the point of view a lot in the story. Um, I first wrote the story in the first person, and it didn't feel right. It felt like I was writing one of my poems, and this was not intended to be one. So in switching it to the third, really kind of gave me the bird's eye view of everything, and kind of having that perspective and and weaving in my kind of love of what I like to do in poetry helped me kind of make that jump a bit smoother, I would say.
I made a similar jump sort of from poetry to fiction. And although I always sort of had the goal to be a fiction writer more
Yeah.
primarily, but I
Yeah,
thought of
same.
myself, yeah, but for whatever reason, I had the idea that if I wanted to be good at writing fiction, I should learn to write poetry first.
Mm.
Which I think there's good and bad things to say about that. But the thing I found very difficult on is that there's so many words. It
Yeah.
sounds stupid, but
No, but
like,
it's true. Yeah, I know. It's like when I was like writing each chapter, was like, oh, I'm like tired of like writing all these words. When a poem, I can finish it on a page kind of thing.
and there's a lot of utilitarian words, and so trying to, I found it difficult initially. I feel like I kind of hit my stride with it, certainly, but initially I found it very difficult to hit a balance between having a nicely turned phrase, right, or a nice, tense, terse, imagistic line, and being clear what is going on.
Right.
And I'm wondering, like, did you find that poetry grounding to be, what ways did you find it to be helpful? And what ways did you feel maybe it was a little awkward to get into the way the novel shapes? Because the novel is very strange things.
I don't think I found it as awkward. I liked the moments where I had those lines that were very quote unquote poetic. They felt a bit more like a poem to me. And those moments all made it into the book. And those were kind of like keystones, touchstones for me to kind of like mark my progress with, is like, when is the next time I can describe something? When is the next time I can and say something about the what is going on, and kind of do it in a poetic way? Where I stumbled on was the kind of the utilitarian kind of those kind of devices in novel, like the dialogue tags. Those were a couple I would describe as my hindrance, where I would tend to, and I think a lot of new writers in fiction tend to give dialogue tags after something is said. And I did overdo that a little bit, and it kind of slowed down the narrative. But again, working with my editor, we really cut that down, and in doing so, made the moments around that, the ones that were a bit more poetic, kind of shine a bit more. Um,
Who is your editor on this book?
so my editor was AGA Wilmot from Woolsack and
Hmm,
Win. Yeah, they
sure.
were so amazing in like just trusting me and like making things up for this world. That's another thing I learned about fantasy, was like all the stuff you're making up. There's this incredible like insecurity that comes up when I was making things up, because it's like this I'm this is not real, and it felt wrong almost to do. But I had my fun with it where I could. But yeah, AGA at Wilmot really was, in my corner in pushing me kind of to extend the world around Reese into kind of ways that I could not do on my own, I think for sure.
So what else did you do in that editing process? Was it um, pretty focused on those sorts of substantive things of fleshing out the world, or was there, restructuring of the narrative or other things that kind of came into play?
It was mostly about the world structuring and building. The narrative was in place. We didn't touch the narrative. I had it all pretty methodically laid out. It was just I had to go back and find moments where Reese needed to take a breath or something. To I needed to ground the readers more into what Reese was feeling. I kind of skipped over what his like physical reactions were a little bit, and that was super important to where his story was going and where it came from. So I had to, put those moments into the sequence of events. Otherwise, it really felt like we were just kind of pummeling through one event to the next, which is why that's the kind of media and books I like to consume where things happen very quickly. And I think I kind of maybe did that with mine and didn't let things kind of sit in the moment for longer than they needed to, and we had to do that a lot. And in doing so, it kind of naturally built the world around everything a bit more. Yeah.
Did you outline this book before you wrote it?
More or less. I think I outlined probably like 85% of it.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, and there were kind of blank spots where I just didn't know what to do, and until I reached those moments was when I felt like, I could outline. But I think I'm like not really an outliner, as much as, I think some people could be when they're writing a novel. I think it's super important and helpful to have some skeleton at least. I like to have what I'm finding helpful in outlining novels is separating to, three acts and then having 10 chapters in each act because that's just even for me to think about and easy for me to sketch the skeleton of the plot out. Mm.
Now, as a person who has, you know, let's say trained or established themselves in sort of, poetry, and then, you know, you you co-edited a fiction book anthology
Yeah.
with Daniel Zolperelli.
Yeah.
It was called Queer Little Nightmares,
Yep.
and it's lots of monstrous fiction and poetry. So there's a bit of fiction and poetry in there. But
Yeah.
when you make the decision, I'm going to move into fiction more substantially, write a novel, and so on. How do you get your bearings to do that? Are you writing fiction on the side and you're just not publishing it prior to this point? Or are you making an active decision that, like, I'm going to pivot now? And if so, like, what is do you just start doing it, or do you just start, or you like seek out some advice? Do you start researching it? Like what is the sort of your process in terms of reorienting your career in that certain sense? Like maybe you'll go right back into poetry after this, but in a sense, there's that reorientation of what you're doing, changing mediums. I think a lot of people when they decide to move from something like poetry or screenwriting or whatever into fiction, say, when they kind of shift like that,
Yeah.
it's just not an immediate, easy shift. I'm just curious to know how you manage that shift. Like, what did you seek out in terms of help, or did you just, see how it went? Like, what was your
I
process?
I was definitely in the camp of like just seeing how it went. I don't consider this novel to be kind of like a shift into genres. I don't feel like that's right to describe kind of how I approach fiction. I always have a foot in poetry and fiction. When I was writing Novel Dragons, I was simultaneously writing poetry at the same time because it was a break from the fiction and it engaged different parts of my brain, I felt. Um, but yeah, I kind of just set it out doing it on my own and just playing around myself with like kind of an initial image. That's kind of how the fiction starts with me. It's an image or a scene of two characters that I kind of get a sense of where they're coming from, and I start writing that. Yeah, I wouldn't like to consider myself or would to be someone who's shifting away from one genre to the other. I like to keep as many tentacles in all the genres that I'm in just to kind of like, yeah, just to see what I can take from my poetry into my fiction and vice versa. Editing that anthology with Daniel was super fun because that's when I was really had my first hand at editing fiction, and Daniel was a really great mentor to me. He's a great friend of mine. He's a poet first. Yeah, he's a poet first and made the shift into fiction. So we understand each other and where we come from in terms of our writing background and what we like. in our in writing. So it was the shift was a simple one. I feel like luckily it was smooth in having him kind of guide how to approach fiction and editing. Um, yeah.
Him and Dina, in a book they co-wrote, did a nice
Oh yeah.
tribute to one of my books. Yeah, yeah, in rom-com, there's a tribute to my book Clockfire in it. So, and Daniel, I've met a few times. He's really, a great guy. But I haven't seen the Queer Little Nightmares anthology, and I'm curious to know a little bit more about just that. Which is, could you just talk a little bit about what that anthology of monstrous fiction and poetry is? In a sense, that's telling you what it is. But
Yeah.
to what degree are is this monstrous fiction and poetry focused? Like, well, what's the attraction to monsters?
So that idea was one that Daniel and I came up with because we bonded over our love of horror movies and monsters. Um, we would just obsess over them, and we would give movie recommendations to each other, book recommendations. And we started talking about this idea of like, I wonder if other queer writers out there have this kind of same obsession with monsters. And that's kind of where the idea came from. We wanted to collect all these writers, fiction writers and poets who had a piece or wanted to write a piece as a kind of an ode or like an inspiration uh, from one of their favorite monsters in mythology or cinema, in literature. And it turns out there's a whole bunch of queer writers who love monsters and all of what they bring. And we wanted the anthology to kind of like bring monsters back into, not from the periphery of societies, but like into like the discourse and make and kind of reclaim the monstrosity identity. Um, and yeah, it was a lovely experience to see like all these different kind of monsters resonate with queer people and align with kind of our history of being sidelined and othered. But we wanted to showcase how monsters can be tender and loving and accepting, because they are just misunderstood as we are, right? And it was a great experiment in yeah, editing and an anthology and just kind of getting a glimpse of the writing that other queer writers were doing out there. And we compiled what we were very proud of, these little nightmares of poems and fiction. I just had It's funny that you bring it up. Today, we had the submission call go out for the follow-up to the anthology, which is called Queer Little Daydreams. I'm co-editing it with Adele Barclay. Unfortunately, Daniel didn't have the time to join the project, but he has we got his blessing to move on. So Queer Little Daydreams is the counterpart to Queer Little Nightmares, and Daydreams will be more about a speculative lens, alternate realities that queers kind of dream of, in a time now where things are so fraught and God dark everywhere. We want to put together an anthology where we want writers to dive into their daydreams and speculates of the beautiful otherness of existing.
What
Yeah.
I like about monsters in the milieu of queerness, let's say, is that I feel like monsters have a interesting radicality to them insofar
Mhm.
as they are, in definition, a category violation and
Yeah.
a transgressive,
Yeah.
binary breaking
Yeah.
thing that reveals fundamentally. I always, when I teach horror courses, I always teach that monsters, are the moral center of the horror story in a
Oh, yeah.
weird sort of way because they always represent the truth,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
usually it's the truth that is showing the lie of these categories that have been established and that conservatively people are trying to keep in place
Yeah.
by destroying the monster. But the
Yeah.
monster, is the truth and is the sort
Hmm.
of the gives the lie to these artificial conservative ideas, of
Right.
conservative in the sense of trying to keep the established structure of the
Hmm.
world or the hierarchy or whatever,
Yeah, I think that's why
false front.
I really am gravitate towards monsters, because what you just said, they transgress boundaries. They're unnatural most of the time. And I think the Queer Little Daydreams, what we're hoping is having kind of a speculative play on it, is speculative fiction, speculative, the genre is in itself, it breaks boundaries. It brings in different forms, different techniques, from different genres. Speculative nonfiction is so crazy to read that you're reading this kind of more or less real thing, and then something so surreal happens. And that's the monstrosity that kind of pokes its head out, right? And it's such a fun area to play in because you kind of, at least in my sense, you get this kind of sense that what you're writing could be wrong, but it feels intriguing because it is wrong, right? It's that's what a monster is to me, at least. Yeah,
Do you consider dragons to be monsters?
100%. They are monsters. They are things that they do exist, but they shouldn't exist, right?
Yeah, right.
They're kind of like this, for me, this ultimate image symbol of great power, but also there's a tragedy, I think, to dragons as well, in that they're not here. They're like they are monsters, I think. Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Um, well, the could you talk just a little bit more about that call? It just strikes me that's so Daniel's or sorry, David's Lee's book, Not All Dragons is out now. And people can go check that out. And also this is an active call right now for
Yep.
writers who are listening. My audience is mostly writers.
Yep.
So writers who are listening can submit. Can you talk a bit about what the
Yep. So the
preciseness of that?
Queer Little Daydreams, we want poetry, fiction, and nonfiction that all have to have a speculative bent to them. So in terms of nonfiction, we don't want critical essays critiquing something cultural. It needs to have this kind of surrealness bent to it. Up to three poems or 3 pages, whichever comes first. For the fiction or nonfiction is the range, the word count is between 1 and 5,000. The deadline is August 1st. You can send your poetry, fiction, or nonfiction to mymonsterwriting@gmail.com. Yeah, we're just gonna see what comes in through the summer, and Adele and I are gonna have a lot of fun sinking our teeth into what people submit, I hope.
I like the idea of having a call that doesn't just ask for fiction or just ask for poetry
Yeah.
and so on, you know?
Yeah, I think that was the really fun part of doing the Queer Little Nightmares is doing poetry and fiction.
Hmm.
Because I like short stories as much as I do, but I think a book of them is a bit, I don't know, it's a bit overwhelming for me. So the poems in it kind of break it up in Nightmares. You'll get a short story or two and then a poem or two to kind of break it up, the reading style of everything. And I'm really excited to bring in nonfiction for this next for the follow-up. And interesting to see kind of where that uh lands us in terms of the reading experience of the anthology, for sure. Yeah.
Oh, and the other thing I think is just interesting about it is on the, you know, theme of, transgressiveness or, or what have you, the uncommonality of these texts, to me is interesting, like to have a diversity of different texts in an anthology.
Right.
I understand and I like anthologies that are just fiction or just poetry or what have you.
Mhm.
But I always wish I saw more anthologies that mixed these forms and
Yeah.
styles. If only because I like personally mixing form styles.
Yeah.
I like to write prose poems that are also essays about film and so on and so forth.
Right.
And so to me, like it's nice to have um, these kinds of anthologies still cropping up that have
Totally.
a variety of things in them.
Yeah, I mean, that's to me, an anthology is a variety of writing, right? It can be a mashup of different genres that circulate as a common theme. And because you have so many different genres or three genres in the anthology, it gives many different access points to the theme that they're all trying to speak to. Yeah.
So, as I wrap up here, David, can I ask you, at this point, are you sick of dragons? Are you? Do you want to write some more about dragons? Where are you at with your
No.
relationship to dragons?
Never sick of dragons. I'm gonna play with them until someone tells me I'm bad at it or I shouldn't do it anymore. Um, but no, I'm not sick of them. I think what Not All Dragons has done is open a world up for me to kind of poke around a bit deeper to see. what other dragons are hiding in it. And of course, like in doing so, the world in Not All Dragons has other creatures as well. The witches, in particular, really interested me. They took on a kind of personality of their own in the book, and you know, hid things or hiding things from me. And I'm really curious to see kind of where that lands. But there'll always be, I think, dragons' presence in books that that I would like to write related to Reese's story for sure. Yeah,
Nice.
in poems I play with dragons as well. I have many poems with dragons in them, and can't tell me stop.
Are you saying you're gonna have a sequel called Not All Witches, or?
No, I do have some things planned. They haven't really fleshed themselves out completely yet for me. Um, but something will come, hopefully. It will not be called Not All Something for sure. It will be called something else.
Well, thanks so much for talking to me, and everyone should check out Not All Dragons by David Lee. Lee is spelled Ly. If you're Googling it, and and some of the other great books. Also should mention you were shortlisted for the Relit Awards for Poetry, which is I'm always wishing I was shortlisted for the Relit Awards for Poetry, and I wish that one award I really wish I could win is that ring.
It is a cool ring, eh? It is
one of these days we'll both have our rings, but yeah, thanks for talking to me, and to everyone listening, check out Not All Dragons. Submit to the anthology and keep writing the wrong way.